I sent out wedding invitations exactly 6 months in advance. 3 weeks before I was supposed to walk down the aisle, my sister scheduled her lavish engagement party for the exact same day and the exact same time. On the most important day of my life, 60 seats on my side of the church sat completely empty. Not a single person from my biological family showed up. But as I stood there cutting my wedding cake, my phone buzzed with an angry text from my father demanding to know what I had just done. I smiled, took a sip of champagne, and watched my smartwatch light up with a breaking news alert. He had no idea that I had just legally seized his future son-in-law's entire fake empire. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to a toxic family member who underestimated your immense true worth. My name is Serena, and I am 33 years old. The heavy wooden doors of the church stood closed in front of me as I waited to make my entrance. I looked through the small glass panes at the front left pews where my parents and extended family were supposed to sit. 60 chairs remained completely empty. My aunts, my uncles, my cousins, people who had never missed a single milestone in my older sister's life, had all decided to skip my wedding. Across the aisle, the right side of the church was absolutely packed with my husband David and his wonderful, supportive family. David is a brilliant, independent architect who loves me unconditionally, but my own parents could not be bothered to show up for us on our special day. Suddenly, I felt a harsh vibration in the hidden pocket of my bridal bouquet. I pulled out my phone and saw a new text message from my father, Winston Dubois. "Vivian and I will wire a gift," his text read. "Do not be dramatic about this, Serena. Julian's family is attending Chloe's engagement party today. Pierce Holdings is a major firm, and we cannot afford to insult white generational wealth. Your little wedding will be fine." I stared at the glowing screen, feeling the familiar sharp sting of lifelong rejection. My sister Chloe was 35 years old and had never worked a single day in her life. She was the pristine golden child of the Dubois family who could do absolutely no wrong. Her new fiancé, Julian Pierce, presented himself as a third-generation real estate heir from a powerful family. My parents, who were entirely obsessed with Atlanta high society and securing their proximity to old money, worshipped the ground Julian walked on. They viewed my career as insignificant and my life as an afterthought. I shed no tears over their absence. I put my phone away and turned to David's mother, who was standing nearby, in a beautiful silver dress, with a look of pure heartbreak for me. She had been watching the doors, hoping for a miracle that I already knew would never arrive, because I understood exactly how my family operated. They chose the country club over the altar, I told her, keeping my voice perfectly steady and cold. Just like they chose to pay her expensive college tuition over mine. David's mother squeezed my hands tightly and told me I was a beautiful, strong woman who deserved so much better than the pain they constantly inflicted. I took a deep breath, held my head high, and walked down the aisle toward the man who actually chose me. The ceremony was absolutely perfect, and I married the love of my life without looking at those empty seats ever again. After the vows, we moved on to our elegant boutique hotel reception, surrounded only by people who genuinely cared for our happiness and our future. Fast forward to the joyous middle of the reception, right as my wonderful husband David and I were getting ready to cut our towering 4-tier wedding cake. The joy in the room was palpable, and the music was playing softly in the background, but I had one last piece of crucial business to attend to. I stepped away from the crowd for a brief moment, took out my phone, and opened a highly classified legal document. It was a formal notice of default and asset seizure. I had personally drafted and prepared days ago, waiting patiently for the perfect moment to strike. I attached the heavy legal file to a direct text message addressed to my father. "Congratulations to Chloe on her big day," I typed carefully. "Please open the attachment. I really hope it does not ruin the expensive caviar at your party." I hit send and slid the phone back onto the table face up. I picked up the silver cake knife with David leaning into his embrace and smiled brightly for the flashing cameras. A read receipt appeared on my screen almost instantly. I counted the seconds in my head, knowing exactly how long it would take him to scan the first page of the document. 10 seconds later, my phone began to vibrate violently against the white tablecloth. 15 missed calls from Winston lit up my screen in rapid succession, each one more desperate than the last. I ignored every single one of them, letting it ring out. My smartwatch vibrated with a breaking news alert. Pierce Holdings files for Chapter 11, Bankruptcy Protection. All corporate and personal assets officially seized by Vanguard Acquisitions. I smiled, feeling a rush of pure adrenaline, and took another long sip of my crisp champagne. My parents had no idea that their rejected scapegoat daughter was the founder and chief executive officer of Vanguard Acquisitions, and I was about to tear their entire illusion of elite generational wealth straight to the ground. Across town, inside the grand ballroom of the Buckhead Country Club, the atmosphere was suffocatingly lavish. Waiters in crisp white tuxedos circulated with trays of imported champagne and gold leaf appetizers. The guest list was a carefully curated collection of Atlanta's black elite mixed with old money power players. My father, Winston Dubois, stood near a towering swan ice sculpture, holding his smartphone with trembling hands. He stared at the PDF attachment I had just sent him. The document was a formal notice of asset seizure directed at the Pierce Family Trust. The paper clearly outlined frozen bank accounts, seized property deeds, and a massive mountain of unpaid federal taxes. At the bottom of the document sat the bold signature of the Chief Executive Officer of Vanguard Acquisitions. Winston blinked rapidly, trying to comprehend the disaster unfolding on his screen. He looked up and locked eyes with Julian Pierce. Julian stood by the open bar, laughing loudly and running a hand through his perfectly styled blonde hair. He looked exactly like the billionaire heir he pretended to be. Winston marched across the marble floor, his heavy footsteps cutting through the upbeat jazz music. He grabbed Julian by the arm and yanked him away from a group of wealthy investors. Julian stumbled, his cocktail spilling onto his velvet jacket. "What is the meaning of this?" Winston demanded, shoving the brightly lit phone screen directly into Julian's face. Julian adjusted his posture, attempting to maintain his arrogant smirk. He glanced at the screen, and the color instantly drained from his face. The confident, wealthy heir vanished, completely replaced by a cornered, desperate fraud. "This is a mistake," Julian stammered, his voice pitching higher than usual. "It is just a bank error, Winston. My family accountants are updating the trust infrastructure this week. Give me a second to call my manager." Julian pulled out his own phone, his hands shaking so violently he dropped it onto the floor. My mother, Vivian, rushed over her diamond necklace, catching the light as she grabbed Winston's shoulder. She plastered a fake smile on her face for the surrounding guests, before leaning in close to whisper harshly, "Do not cause a scene in front of the Jack and Jill board members, Winston. People are staring at us. Julian's family built half of Georgia. We cannot afford to embarrass him today." Winston shoved his phone right into my mother's face. "Look at these numbers, Vivian. Look at them. The account balances are negative. His properties are gone. He is completely broke, and the government is seizing everything." Vivian gasped, pressing a manicured hand over her mouth. Her eyes darted wildly around the room, suddenly terrified that the high society friends she spent decades trying to impress might discover her prized future son-in-law was entirely worthless. A few feet away, my sister Chloe remained completely oblivious to the financial apocalypse destroying her fairy tale engagement. She was too busy living out her delusion of absolute power. A young waiter accidentally bumped her chair while carrying a tray of empty glasses. One glass tipped over and shattered on the floor near her designer heels. "Watch where you are walking, you clumsy idiot!" Chloe screamed, her shrill voice echoing off the high ceilings and silencing the entire room. "Do you know how much these shoes cost? You are completely useless. Get out of my sight before I have my future husband buy this entire country club just to fire you." The sheer entitlement radiating from her was sickening. She spent her entire adult life relying on my father's bank accounts to fund her luxurious lifestyle while mockingly calling me a cubicle slave for earning my own money. Now she stood in the middle of the room shouting about buying a country club with money that literally did not exist. Winston watched Chloe humiliate the waiter, and the reality of the situation finally crashed down on him. The engagement was a total sham. The money was gone. His reputation was on the verge of total collapse. He needed a scapegoat. He desperately needed someone to fix the mess. He needed me. Winston dialed my number again. When the call went to voicemail, he practically screamed his message into the phone. "Serena, pick up this phone right now. Someone at your company just sent me a fake document regarding Julian's accounts. I know you work in the compliance department over there. You need to use your little finance job to log into the system and fix this glitch immediately. Julian's family is extremely wealthy and powerful, and Vanguard Acquisitions is making a massive mistake. Call your manager, call the corporate office, do whatever you have to do to reverse this error before I get you fired." I stood in the lobby of my wedding venue holding David's hand as I listened to the frantic voicemail. My father actually believed I was just a low-level employee who could magically hack a banking system to save his precious reputation. He truly believed he held the power to destroy my career with a single phone call. He still viewed me as the helpless daughter he could command and discard whenever it suited his needs. I opened our text message thread and typed my response with deliberate precision. "There is absolutely no glitch here, Dad. I reviewed Julian's portfolio myself. His trust is entirely empty, and he owes millions in fraudulent loans. I am the one who signed the seizure order. You cannot call my manager to get me fired because I do not have a manager. I own the company. I am Vanguard." I hit send and watched the message deliver. The power shift was absolute and entirely irreversible. My family spent my entire life trying to make me feel worthless. They chose a fraudulent stranger over their own flesh and blood because they worshipped the illusion of status. Now they were finally facing the devastating consequences of their toxic greed. I set my phone face down on the silk tablecloth, just as David's best man raised his glass to begin his toast. The clinking of crystal echoed through the opulent ballroom of the St. Regis. Warm amber lighting bathed the room in a golden glow, reflecting off the towering floral centerpieces. My husband squeezed my hand, his eyes shining with pure adoration. For exactly 3 minutes, I allowed myself to simply exist in that perfect bubble of happiness. I listened to the heartfelt words of a man who had known David since childhood, celebrating our future together. The contrast between the genuine love in this room and the toxic transactional world my family inhabited could not have been starker. I felt truly at peace. Then the heavy oak doors at the back of the ballroom violently burst open. The heavy thud of wood slamming against the plaster walls echoed over the soft instrumental music playing beneath the toast. Conversations instantly died. Heads turned in unison. My father Winston stormed into the room, his face a deep shade of crimson. Close behind him marched my mother Vivian, her diamond necklace glittering aggressively under the chandeliers. Chloe followed, trailing slightly behind them, holding the hand of her fiancé Julian Pierce. They marched down the center aisle, completely disregarding the best man who had frozen midway through his speech. They ignored the shocked murmurs rippling through the tables of our esteemed guests. They did not care that they were ruining the most sacred moment of my life. They only cared about their fractured egos and desperate need to maintain appearances. Vivian reached the sweetheart table first. She did not say a single word of greeting. She marched directly to my side of the table, raised her manicured hand, and slapped me hard across the left cheek. The sharp crack of her palm against my skin rang out like a gunshot in the dead, silent room. Several guests gasped. David's chair scraped harshly against the marble floor as he immediately shot up from his seat. He stepped protectively in front of me, using his broad shoulders to physically block my mother from coming any closer. His eyes were dark and his jaw was clenched so tight a muscle jumped in his cheek. "Do not ever lay a hand on my wife again," David warned, his voice dangerously low and steady. "If you take one more step toward her, I will have security drag you out of this building in handcuffs." Vivian ignored him, completely craning her neck to glare at me around his shoulder. "You malicious, jealous little brat!" she screamed, her voice shrill and trembling with unhinged fury. "You fabricated documents to ruin your sister's engagement just because she married into real money. You are absolutely pathetic, Serena. You could not stand the fact that Chloe secured a Pierce, so you decided to play pretend on your computer to humiliate us in front of the entire Jack and Jill board. I stepped out from behind David, gently placing a reassuring hand on his tense arm. I touched my stinging cheek, feeling the heat radiating from the slap. A slow, cold smile spread across my face. I did not yell. I did not cry. I looked directly at the DJ booth in the corner and raised 2 fingers, signaling him to cut the instrumental track completely. The sudden heavy silence in the ballroom became a physical weight. I am not playing pretend mother, I stated, keeping my tone remarkably calm and even. I sent you legally binding financial records. If you choose to remain willfully blind to the truth, because it shatters your desperate social climbing fantasies, that is your personal failure. It is not my problem. Chloe stepped forward, clutching her incredibly large engagement ring, as if I might reach out and steal it. You are lying, she shrieked, pointing an accusing finger at my wedding dress. Julian is a billionaire. His family owns half the commercial real estate in this city. You are just bitter because David is a freelance nobody making pennies while I am marrying a true mogul. You forged those bank statements because you want to destroy my happiness today. David did not even flinch at her insult. He simply looked at Chloe with a mixture of profound pity and absolute disgust. I let out a sharp, genuine laugh that seemed to deeply unsettle my father. Winston stepped up beside his favored daughter, his chest puffed out in a pathetic display of patriarchal authority. You will fix this right now, Serena, Winston demanded, his voice echoing off the high ceiling. I do not care what kind of illegal access you have at that firm. You will log back into the system and reverse whatever fake holds you placed on Julian's accounts. You are going to call your superiors and clear his name before I personally call the police and have you arrested for corporate sabotage. You are destroying this family over your petty jealousy. I stared at the man who had drained my college fund to buy his golden child a sports car. I stared at the woman who just assaulted me at my own wedding reception. I looked at the sister who spent her entire life stepping on my neck to elevate herself. You cannot have me arrested for corporate sabotage, Dad, I replied, enunciating every single syllable. Because you cannot sabotage your own company. Vanguard Acquisitions bought Pierce Holdings' toxic debt 3 days ago. I authorized the purchase. I authorized the asset freeze. You demanded that I not be dramatic today, so I am simply executing standard corporate protocol. Julian finally stepped forward from the back of their group. He adjusted his heavy gold Rolex, attempting to project effortless white privilege and old money intimidation. He puffed out his chest, looking down at me with an arrogant smirk. You are playing a dangerous game, little girl, Julian warned. My family's lawyers will bury you for corporate sabotage. I threw my head back and let out a sharp, ringing laugh that bounced off the crystal chandeliers above us. The sound was not hysterical or forced in any way. It was the genuine, uncontrollable amusement of a woman watching a cornered rat pretend to be a roaring lion. The entire ballroom held its collective breath. Waiters froze with silver trays suspended in midair. David remained firmly planted by my side, a silent, towering sentinel, allowing me to dismantle this massive fraud on my own terms. Julian lowered his arm, his fake Rolex gleaming under the ambient lighting, and his smug expression faltered for a fraction of a second. I stepped around the sweetheart table, my heavy silk train gliding across the marble floor, closing the distance between us, until I was standing mere inches from his perfectly tailored suit. I did not blink. I did not retreat. I looked right through the fragile facade of his manufactured white privilege. Bury me for corporate sabotage, I repeated, letting the heavy words hang in the tense air. Julian, you do not even have the liquid capital to pay a basic retainer fee for a junior associate, let alone an entire team of corporate litigators. You are a walking, breathing illusion. Did you really think you could stroll into Buckhead, target an affluent black family, desperate for proximity to old money, and treat us like uneducated, gullible marks? Did you think I would not check your uniform commercial code filings before allowing you anywhere near my family assets? I pulled my sleek tablet from the table and tapped the screen, projecting the display directly onto the large media wall the DJ had been using for our monogram. Massive spreadsheets highlighted legal red lines, and offshore banking routes flooded the room in glaring high definition. Let us talk about high-level equity, Julian. Let us talk about the $50 million in toxic mezzanine debt your so-called family trust defaulted on exactly 3 years ago. Let us discuss the cascading wire fraud charges quietly building up in Delaware while you parade around Atlanta pretending your name actually means something. You thought we were just status-obsessed fools who would eagerly hand over our generational wealth because you flashed a bright smile and whispered sweet nothings about your grandfather's imaginary real estate empire. You thought my father was an easy target and you were absolutely right about him. But you were completely wrong about me. Julian's face turned a blotchy shade of crimson. The charming, sophisticated persona he had carefully cultivated over the past year evaporated instantly, leaving behind a terrified con artist. He looked around the room, realizing that some of the most powerful financial minds in the city were sitting at my wedding tables reading his absolute ruin on the digital projector. He tugged at his silk collar, suddenly sweating under the ballroom lights. Unable to face me, he turned his back completely, disregarding my presence in a blatant display of disrespect. He looked directly at my father, who was still staring at the screen in absolute horror. "Control your daughter, Winston." Julian snapped, his voice dripping with intense condescension and thinly veiled racism. "You need to handle this situation right now. She is throwing a hysterical temper tantrum. She does not understand how high-level equity works or how these temporary liquidity transfers operate in the real world. Silence her before she causes permanent damage to our joint ventures." I did not let my father utter a single syllable. I stepped right into Winston's line of sight, physically blocking his view of the man he desperately wanted to call his son. "Control me?" I asked, my voice dropping to a dangerous, razor-sharp whisper that somehow carried to every quiet corner of the room. "You could not even control your own basic checking account, Dad. You want to talk to him about high-level equity when you do not even possess fundamental financial literacy." I stared into my father's panicked eyes, forcing him to confront the ugly truth he had buried for over a decade. "Do you remember the day I got my acceptance letter to Wharton? Do you remember looking me in the face and telling me the business world was too tough for a woman like me? You told me the college fund Grandma left me was tied up in bad investments. You lied to my face. You drained my entire tuition fund, down to the very last cent, just to buy Chloe a brand new Porsche for her 25th birthday, because she threw a massive tantrum about her country club friends having better cars. You threw my entire future away to fund her shallow vanity. You left me with absolutely nothing. I had to learn equity the hard way. I took out massive predatory loans, worked 3 jobs, slept in library cubicles, and built an entire corporate empire from scratch, while you happily funded her pathetic delusions. My mother gasped loudly, clutching her chest as if she had been physically struck by my words. Chloe stared at me, her mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish, completely unable to comprehend the harsh reality of the situation. Winston looked down at his expensive leather shoes, entirely stripped of his patriarchal authority. He had no power here, and he finally knew it. Julian realized his primary defender had been entirely neutralized. He took a slow, calculated step backward toward the heavy oak doors, his eyes darting toward the exit. He was preparing to run. I raised my right hand high in the air and snapped my fingers twice. The sharp sound echoed through the silent ballroom like a gavel striking wood. Instantly, the heavy doors swung open again. 2 tall, broad-shouldered men in sharp dark suits marched into the reception hall. They moved with a chilling, practiced efficiency, bypassing the shocked guests and walking directly toward the sweetheart table. One of them held a thick leather binder stamped with the official seal of a federal compliance officer. I looked back at Julian and then shifted my gaze to my sister, who was still gripping her left hand defensively. I pointed directly at the heavy gold watch on Julian's wrist, and then at the massive, blinding diamond sitting on Chloe's finger. "Julian," I said, my voice ringing out with absolute, unwavering authority, "tell my sister where you actually rented that ring from." He instinctively covered his watch, taking a step backward toward the heavy oak doors. The stern federal compliance officer blocked his path. Chloe looked down at her massive diamond, her pretty face twisting into pure panic. She shook her head furiously, stepping directly in front of Julian. "You are completely out of your mind, Serena," Chloe shrieked across the grand ballroom. "Julian personally bought this gorgeous ring in Paris. It is a flawless custom-cut diamond from his private jeweler. You are just jealous because David gave you that pathetic little speck of dust on your finger." I ignored her frantic screeching. I turned my back and walked confidently toward the audio-visual podium next to the DJ. I unplugged the connection cable and plugged it directly into my iPad. The massive projector screen behind us flickered. I tapped the screen once, bringing up a highly classified dossier that my team at Vanguard Acquisitions had spent hours compiling. "Look very closely, Chloe," I commanded, pointing at the towering digital display. The massive screen lit up the ballroom with stark black and white financial records. At the top, stamped in bold federal lettering, was a Chapter 11 bankruptcy filing. The corporate name listed on the official docket was Pierce Holdings. The stamped date was exactly 5 years ago. "Pierce Holdings does not exist anymore, Dad," I announced, projecting my voice so everyone could hear. "The legendary Pierce real estate empire collapsed half a decade ago. They liquidated everything to pay off massive corporate debts and offshore gambling syndicates. Julian is not a billionaire heir. He is a glorified con artist carrying a briefcase full of maxed-out credit cards." Winston stared blankly at the screen, his mouth open, the arrogance completely drained from his posture. Vivian clutched the sweetheart table, her knuckles turning white as she read the negative balances. I tapped my screen again, bringing up a complex web of shell companies and behavioral profiles. "Julian has a very specific, calculated predatory pattern," I explained, pacing slowly in front of the brightly illuminated, undeniable financial data. "He intentionally targets wealthy, insecure, status-obsessed African American families in elite social circles. He specifically preys on people exactly like you, Mom and Dad. People who are so desperate for the validation of proximity to white old money that they will throw their own daughters aside for a seat. He knew you would never run a background check on a Pierce because you were too busy bragging about his last name at the country club." Chloe clamped her hands over her ears, refusing to process the reality unfolding. She squeezed her eyes shut and began to hyperventilate, her chest heaving violently. When she finally opened her eyes, she refused to look at the projector. Instead, she locked her furious gaze onto me, her face contorted with rage. "You manipulated these files!" Chloe screamed, her voice breaking into a hysterical sob. "You are lying! You paid someone to fabricate these documents just to ruin my life. You have always been jealous of me, Serena. You are just furious because my future husband is a mogul and you married a freelancer. David makes absolute pennies drawing blueprints while Julian travels the world. You are pathetic." The room fell into an incredibly uncomfortable, heavy silence. David, who had remained a steady grounding force by my side, calmly stepped forward. He reached out and smoothly pulled the microphone from the DJ booth. He did not look angry. He simply looked incredibly bored by her delusion. "Chloe," David said, his deep voice carrying effortlessly through the sound system, "I do not work in a cramped apartment. I own a highly successful commercial architecture firm. In fact, if you look at the architectural plaque in the main lobby of this boutique hotel you are standing in, you will see my name. My firm designed this entire building from the ground up. I am not a freelancer. I am the man who literally built the room you are throwing your temper tantrum inside." A collective gasp rippled through the audience. My mother looked at David as if seeing him for the first time, her eyes wide. For years she had dismissed him as a struggling artist simply because he did not boast about his wealth at dinner parties. He did not need to wear a rented Rolex to prove his exceptional worth. Chloe stumbled backward, the wind completely knocked out of her sails. She looked desperately at Julian, her eyes begging him to say something to fix the narrative, to prove that he was the man he claimed to be. But Julian remained completely silent, his eyes darting frantically toward the federal officer blocking the exit. I took the microphone from David, giving him a quick smile before turning back to my father. Winston was staring blankly at the floor, looking like a man who had watched his world crumble. He had sacrificed his relationship with his youngest daughter to secure a legacy that was nothing more than cheap smoke and mirrors. I tapped my iPad one final time. The screen behind me shifted instantly. The bankruptcy filings vanished, replaced by a massive wire transfer log, originating directly from Dubois Real Estate, my father's primary account. The flashing numbers were stark, undeniable, and utterly devastating. I locked eyes with my father, watching the absolute terror wash over his aging face as he fully realized the disastrous magnitude of his incredibly foolish status-obsessed mistakes. Julian is completely broke. Dad? I said, my voice cutting through the tension like a sharpened blade. He has absolutely no corporate assets, no hidden trust fund, and zero liquid capital. So right now, I have a very simple direct question just for you. I pointed directly at the massive numbers highlighted in red on the screen. How exactly did $4 million randomly move from Dubois Real Estate directly into Julian's unregulated offshore shell company late last Tuesday night without your own explicit written approval? Winston turned an alarming shade of ash gray. The deep crimson flush that had previously fueled his arrogant march into my wedding reception instantly evaporated, leaving his skin looking hollow and incredibly fragile. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. His wide, terrified eyes remained locked on the glaring red numbers projected onto the massive screen behind me. $4 million. It was the entirety of the Dubois Real Estate liquid operating capital. It was the very lifeblood he needed to keep his own aging empire afloat, and he had signed it away in the dark. Vivian immediately went into a state of frantic, panicked damage control. Her entire identity was built on the fragile foundation of high society perception, and she was currently watching it burn to the ground in front of Atlanta's most elite circles. "Stop looking at that," she demanded, flapping her arms wildly at the seated guests. "Turn that off right now." She lunged toward the audio-visual podium, her diamond bracelets clanking together, as she blindly slammed her manicured hands against the control board. When the screen remained locked on the damning wire transfer logs, she physically threw herself in front of the projector lens. She stood on her tiptoes, casting a dark, distorted shadow over the financial ruin of her family. "This is a private family matter," Vivian shrieked, her voice echoing terribly through the silent ballroom. "Everyone look away immediately." Chloe, however, remained entirely trapped in her carefully constructed delusion. She absolutely refused to look at the screen. She refused to look at her hyperventilating mother or her paralyzed father. Instead, she threw both of her arms around Julian, gripping his tailored suit jacket like a drowning woman clinging to a life raft. "You are all so incredibly stupid," Chloe yelled, leaning heavily against the man who had just stolen her inheritance. "Julian is not broke. He is a financial genius. He was doubling our money. He is investing it in a massive smart city project in Dubai. He told me all about it last week. It is a highly exclusive international venture, and Dad was lucky to get in on the ground floor. We are going to make tens of millions of dollars." I stared at my older sister, feeling a strange mixture of absolute disgust and profound pity. She was so desperate to maintain her illusion of superiority that she was actively defending the predator who had just slaughtered her future. I slowly walked around the edge of the sweetheart table, my heels clicking sharply against the marble floor. I stopped directly in front of her, ensuring she had nowhere else to look but at my face. "You are 35 years old, Chloe," I stated, my voice perfectly level and carrying effortlessly across the quiet room. "You are 35 years old, and you have never worked a single day in your entire life. You spent the last 10 years traveling between luxury resorts in Bali and Milan, supposedly finding yourself on Dad's credit cards. You contributed absolutely nothing to society while simultaneously looking down your nose at me. You spent my entire adulthood mocking my ambition. You called me a pathetic cubicle slave because I actually woke up every morning and earned my own paycheck." Chloe glared at me, her chest heaving violently, but she did not interrupt. She gripped Julian's arm even tighter, her knuckles turning white. "So please," I continued, gesturing toward the massive screen behind me, "do not stand in my venue and try to lecture me about international business ventures. There is no smart city project in Dubai, Chloe. There are no exclusive international returns. Do you want to know exactly where that $4 million went? I tapped my iPad, advancing to the next highly classified slide. The screen shifted, displaying a clear, heavily documented breakdown of the wire transfer's final destinations. A collective murmur of shock rippled through our wedding guests as the brutal truth was laid bare in indisputable black and white. Your brilliant billionaire fiancé used $1.2 million to pay off aggressive offshore loan sharks who were actively threatening to break his legs, I explained, reading the figures aloud for the entire room to hear. He used another $2 million to settle a massive mountain of federal back taxes because the government was preparing to seize his leased sports cars and freeze his fraudulent bank accounts. The remaining $800,000 went toward paying off his mounting luxury credit card debt so he could keep buying you expensive dinners and pretend he was still a king. He bled our father dry to save his own skin. Winston let out a terrible, choked sound. He stumbled backward, crashing heavily into a vacant chair at the nearest guest table. He grabbed the center of his chest, his fingers digging deeply into his expensive tuxedo jacket. He was gasping for air, his eyes wide with unadulterated terror. The reality of his absolute financial ruin was physically destroying him. He looked up at Julian, his face contorted with panic and rage. "My money!" Winston wheezed, struggling to draw breath into his tightening lungs. "Give me my money back, Julian. Right now. You promised me guaranteed returns. You promised me a seat on the Pierce Holdings executive board." The room watched in stunned silence as the final piece of the illusion shattered. Julian Pierce, the charming, sophisticated heir, the man my family had worshipped as a god, completely dropped his refined facade. He did not look ashamed. He did not look apologetic. He looked at my father with nothing but pure predatory contempt. He gently pried Chloe's clinging hands off his jacket and took a step away from her, isolating himself from the sinking ship. Julian let out a cold, cruel laugh that chilled the entire room. He stared down at Winston, his lip curling into an ugly, arrogant sneer. "Give you your money back." Julian mocked, his tone dripping with absolute disdain. "You practically handed me that money, old man. I did not even have to work hard for it. You were so desperate to brag about having a Pierce at your pathetic little country club that you completely blinded yourself to basic due diligence. You practically begged me to take your capital just so you could feel like you finally belonged to real high society. You bought your own ticket to ruin Winston. Do not blame me for cashing the check." The sheer audacity of his confession shattered whatever fragile restraint remained in my father's mind. A guttural roar of pure animalistic rage ripped from Winston's throat. He lunged at Julian, his hands curled into violent fists, aiming directly for the con artist's smug face. He wanted to physically tear the truth out of the man who had just bankrupted his entire legacy. He never made contact. David moved with terrifying speed, stepping smoothly between them and planting a firm hand flat against my father's chest. He shoved Winston backward with just enough calculated force to hold him back and stop his momentum. Julian instantly scuttled backward like a frightened rat, using a hyperventilating Chloe as a human shield against the violence he had provoked. "Do not touch him!" David commanded, his voice a low, dangerous rumble that echoed over the sound system. "Let the federal authorities handle the garbage. You are not ruining my wedding with a fistfight." Winston stood trembling, his chest heaving violently as he stared at the man who had effortlessly stolen his life savings. With Julian safely out of reach, my mother instantly sought a new target for her skyrocketing panic. Vivian could never accept responsibility for her own disastrous choices. She needed a scapegoat, and she immediately locked her manicured sights on me. Vivian began crying, real tears of pure terror leaking from her perfectly painted eyes. She pointed an accusing, trembling finger directly at my face, shifting the blame to the only person who had actually tried to help her. "If you knew this, why did you not warn us?" she wailed, her voice cracking under the weight of her public humiliation. "You let us walk into a trap." Her ability to rewrite history in real time in front of hundreds of witnesses was genuinely breathtaking. I did not yell. I did not raise my voice to match her hysterics. I simply reached into the hidden pocket of my bridal gown and produced a printed email from a month ago. I had prepared for this exact accusation, knowing my mother would inevitably try to shift the blame to protect her fragile ego. I unfolded the paper and held it up high for her to clearly see the timestamp and her own email address. I tried, Mother, I stated, my voice cutting through her theatrical sobbing with absolute surgical precision. I sent you Julian's public bankruptcy filings. I highlighted his offshore debts and attached 3 separate investigative articles detailing his history of targeting wealthy families. Do you remember what you sent back to me? Vivian froze, her tears drying instantly upon her cheeks. Her eyes darted away from the printed paper, suddenly terrified of what I was about to expose. I did not give her the chance to interrupt or deflect. I looked directly at her and read her own horrific words back to her. You replied, "Stop spreading lies because you cannot find a high-value man." I read, projecting my voice so every single guest sitting at those expensive tables could hear her shame. I handed you the absolute truth on a silver platter, and you completely rejected it. You chose a white con artist's lies over your own black daughter's facts. The ballroom remained entirely silent. The heavy truth of my words settled over the crowd, suffocating the last remaining shreds of my parents' carefully manicured reputation. Several of my mother's wealthy socialite friends, the same women she had spent decades desperately trying to impress, turned their heads away in obvious disgust. Vivian covered her face with her hands, finally experiencing genuine shame. She had exposed her own toxic, shallow nature to the exact people whose opinions she valued above her own children. She had allowed her obsession with proximity to perceived white wealth to completely blind her to a predator standing right in her living room. While my mother drowned in her public humiliation, my father was drowning in a much more literal sense. The devastating reality of the missing $4 million was physically destroying him. That money was not just his personal savings, it was the heavily leveraged operating capital for Dubois Real Estate. Without it, his company would collapse before the end of the fiscal quarter. The board of directors would absolutely crucify him for transferring corporate funds to an unverified offshore shell company without a single background check. Winston's knees buckled beneath his weight. He fell to his knees, collapsing heavily onto the marble floor directly in front of the sweetheart table. His breathing was shallow and rapid, his expensive tailored tuxedo pooling awkwardly around his trembling frame. He looked up at me, eyes manic. The arrogant, demanding patriarch I had known my entire life was completely gone. In his place was a broken, desperate man, staring at the daughter he had consistently undervalued and routinely dismissed. His mind raced frantically, connecting the dots of my corporate identity. He stared at the glowing projector screen displaying Vanguard Acquisitions' logo, and then looked back at my calm expression. He realized the true extent of the power I held in that exact moment. "You own Vanguard," he gasped, his voice a desperate, raspy wheeze. "You bought his debt. That means you control the funds." I stared down at the man who had drained my college fund to buy Chloe a sports car, feeling absolutely nothing but cold, professional detachment. Winston crawled forward on his hands and knees, reaching out to grab the hem of my silk wedding dress with shaking, sweating fingers. He looked up at me with pleading, desperate eyes, begging me to save him from the consequences of his own toxic greed. "Transfer the $4 million back to the family company," Serena Winston begged, his voice cracking with pure, pathetic desperation. "We can cover this up before the board finds out." I did not flinch as Julian delivered his final sickening blow. My father remained on his knees, his hands still desperately clutching the pristine white silk of my wedding gown. He looked up at me with wild, pleading eyes, waiting for me to magically erase the catastrophic consequences of his own monumental ego. I looked down at his trembling hands and felt a profound sense of absolute closure. I reached down and firmly pried his clammy fingers off my dress. I stepped away from the podium and slowly walked down the short flight of stairs descending from the stage. The heavy silk of my gown swept across the polished marble floor, a soft rustling sound that cut through the dead silence of the grand ballroom. I stopped a few feet away from where my father knelt, staring down at him with the exact same cold, analytical detachment he had always reserved for me. "I am not your personal bank, Dad," I stated, my voice echoing clearly without the need for a microphone. "That money is gone. It has already been seized, reallocated, and absorbed by Vanguard Acquisitions to cover Julian's outstanding federal penalties. Your company is technically insolvent. There is no money left to transfer back. There is no magic fix. Dubois Real Estate is dead." Winston recoiled as if I had physically struck him. The sheer terror in his eyes morphed rapidly into a frantic, desperate anger. He scrambled awkwardly to his feet, his expensive tuxedo wrinkled and stained with sweat. He pointed a shaking finger at me, his face contorted into a mask of pure patriarchal rage. "You cannot do this to your own flesh and blood," Winston bellowed, spittle flying from his lips. "You are a Dubois. I am your father, and I built that empire from the ground up to provide for this family. You have a familial duty to protect our legacy, Serena. You have a duty to fix this right now." The utter hypocrisy of his demand ignited a slow, burning fire in my chest. But I did not yell. I did not lose my temper. Instead, I unleashed 15 years of suppressed rage in the only language Winston Dubois truly understood: cold, ruthless corporate terms. "Familial duty," I repeated, tilting my head slightly as I analyzed the broken man in front of me. "Is that the exact same familial duty you exercised when you explicitly told me I was socially unfit to attend the annual Dubois charity galas?" "I remember your exact words, Winston. You said my introverted nature and refusal to wear whatever uncomfortable designer label Vivian selected was a liability to your corporate image. You paraded Chloe around like a prized corporate asset because she knew how to smile and flirt with your investors. You treated me like a bad investment. You shoved me into the background hoping I would simply disappear so you could maintain your flawless high society facade. You wanted me invisible, Dad. Congratulations. To Dubois Real Estate I currently am." Vivian gasped from her position near the sweetheart table, but I ignored her. Chloe was still crying silently, her mascara running down her cheeks, but she lacked the courage to look at me. David stood a few feet away, watching my back like a silent sentinel, his steady presence giving me the strength to finally finish this. "For 15 years, I watched you prioritize vanity over substance." I continued pacing slowly in front of my father. "You operated this family like a poorly managed hedge fund. You poured all your capital into Chloe, expecting a massive return on investment simply because she looked the part. You completely ignored my potential because I actually wanted to work for a living rather than marry into old money. You wrote me off as a sunk cost. Well, the market has officially corrected itself. Your prized asset just bankrupted you, and the daughter you wrote off is the only one holding the keys to your survival." Winston opened his mouth to argue, to demand, to threaten, but his words failed him. He looked around the ballroom, seeking a single sympathetic face among his wealthy peers. He found none. The country club elite he had spent millions trying to impress were watching his public execution with morbid fascination. They were predators themselves, and they could smell blood in the water. I turned my back on my father and walked calmly toward the stern federal compliance officer who remained stationed near the main exit. He reached into his leather briefcase and retrieved a thick, crisp manila folder. He handed it to me with a brief professional nod. I took the folder and walked back to my father, pulling a sleek black pen from the front pocket of David's tuxedo jacket as I passed him. I stopped in front of Winston and slapped the heavy legal document directly onto the nearest empty guest table. The sharp smack of the paper against the wood made my father physically flinch. "I will not bail you out, Dad," I said, my voice dropping to a low, lethal register. "I will not give you a single dime to cover up your gross negligence and your pathetic, desperate need for social validation. But I will buy Dubois Real Estate." Winston stared at the document, his eyes darting frantically to the Vanguard Acquisitions letterhead printed at the very top of the page. "You want to buy the company?" he whispered, a tiny sliver of foolish hope returning to his voice. "For how much?" I looked him dead in the eyes and smiled a cold, calculated smile that contained absolutely zero warmth. For exactly $1, I stated, leaning forward so he could hear every single syllable clearly. $1, Winston. That is the current market value of your entire life. Sign the contract right now and surrender all executive control to Vanguard. Sign it, and I will absorb your debt and prevent your massive creditors from seizing your personal assets. Refuse to sign it or attempt to negotiate, and you will absolutely default on Monday morning. And when the federal auditors realize you illegally wired $4 million of corporate operating capital into an unregulated offshore shell company without board approval, you will face federal embezzlement charges. You have exactly 60 seconds to decide if you want to be a retired grandfather or a convicted felon. The clock was ticking. Winston remained frozen on the marble floor, his breath rattling in his chest as he stared at the Vanguard acquisitions contract. He was a man who had spent his entire life bullying others into submission, and now he was completely paralyzed by his own total defeat. Seeing that her husband had been entirely neutralized, Vivian realized the power dynamic in the room was rapidly slipping out of her control. She needed to immediately hijack the narrative. She needed to change the subject and turn herself into the victim. Taking a deep, jagged breath, Vivian executed a maneuver I had seen her perfect over decades of social warfare. She let out a piercing, high-pitched shriek and dramatically clutched the center of her chest. Her diamond bracelets clattered loudly against her chest as she swayed on her designer heels. With a loud, tragic gasp, she collapsed backward against the edge of the sweetheart table, knocking over a crystal champagne flute. She slid down the tablecloth and crumpled onto the floor. My heart. Vivian wailed, fanning her face frantically with her manicured hand. Winston, my heart is giving out. I cannot breathe. The stress of this vicious, unprovoked attack is killing me. Someone call a doctor immediately. My own daughter is trying to put me in an early grave. Several guests at the front tables gasped and half rose from their seats, unsure if they should intervene. Chloe screamed for someone to call an ambulance, her voice cracking with fresh panic. I did not flinch. I did not take a single step toward her. I stared down at her theatrical performance with absolute freezing contempt. I simply looked over my shoulder and gave a sharp, prearranged nod to the venue manager standing by the kitchen doors. The manager immediately marched forward, holding a two-way radio to his mouth. Mom, he announced, his voice echoing loudly through the silent ballroom. We anticipated a potential medical emergency tonight. We have a fully staffed private ambulance waiting directly outside the loading dock. EMTs are walking into the ballroom right now with a stretcher and a defibrillator. Vivian's eyes snapped wide open. The horrifying mental image of being strapped to a medical gurney and wheeled through the lobby of a luxury hotel with ruined hair and smeared makeup was a fate worse than death. She miraculously found her strength. She sat bolt upright, instantly smoothing the wrinkles out of her silk evening gown and aggressively swatting away the venue manager's extended hand. That will not be necessary. Vivian snapped, her voice entirely devoid of the breathy weakness she had just faked. I do not need a stretcher. I just need a moment to catch my breath. The sheer shock of this unnatural betrayal simply overwhelmed my system. I crossed my arms and offered her a tight, mocking smile. Your miraculous recoveries are always so incredibly inspiring, Mother, I said. But you are completely out of tricks. The audience sees right through the act. You are fine. Vivian scrambled to her feet, her face flushing an angry mottled red. Since the frail dying victim routine had failed, she immediately resorted to her favorite weapon. She pivoted to vicious, aggressive maternal guilt. She marched right up to me, jabbing her finger dangerously close to my face. You are an ungrateful little monster, Vivian hissed, her voice vibrating with pure toxic venom. I carried you for 9 months. I went through the agony of labor to bring you into this world. I gave you life, Serena. I clothed you and fed you and put a roof over your head. We gave you the prestigious Dubois name. You owe us everything. You are legally and morally obligated to help this family when we are in need. I stepped directly into her personal space, forcing her to look right into my eyes. I did not raise my voice, but the sheer coldness of my tone made her physically flinch. I owe you absolutely nothing, I stated. In fact, you owe me. You owe me exactly $200,000 plus 15 years of compound interest. Vivian went completely rigid. The angry flush drained from her face, leaving her looking pale and terrified. Her jaw clamped shut, and she darted a panicked glance toward Winston, who had buried his face in his hands. Did you really think I would never find out? I continued slowly pacing around her so the entire room could hear my words. Grandma Dubois left a $200,000 trust fund entirely in my name when she died. It was legally designated as my college fund. It was supposed to be my safety net. But when I turned 18 and walked into the bank to claim my inheritance, the teller informed me the account was completely empty. I reached into the inner pocket of David's tuxedo jacket and pulled out a thick stack of printed bank records. I held them up, shaking the papers slightly. I pulled the archived withdrawal slips last week, I announced. I have the copies right here. You forged my signature on my 18th birthday, Vivian. You walked into that bank and committed felony wire fraud against your own flesh and blood. And do you want to know what my mother bought with my future? I turned away from her and looked directly at the crowd of wealthy socialites who were watching the scene unfold with morbid, horrified fascination. She used my college fund to renovate her kitchen, I declared, my voice ringing with righteous anger. She spent $200,000 of my money on imported Italian marble countertops, custom copper fixtures, and a commercial-grade wine cellar just so she could host better dinner parties for all of you. She stole my entire education to upgrade her appliances. A collective, audible gasp rippled through the guests. In their elite circles, stealing from a designated family trust fund was an unforgivable sin, but getting caught doing it for something as vulgar and shallow as a kitchen renovation was absolute social suicide. The women Vivian had spent decades trying to impress were now looking at her with undisguised revulsion. That money was meant for the household. Vivian stammered, her voice shrill and desperate as she tried to defend the indefensible. You lived in that house, Serena. You benefited from those upgrades. We were investing in the family estate. You are a thief, I said coldly, tossing the bank records onto the floor at her feet. You are a common thief who happens to wear expensive pearls. You and Dad are exactly the same. You both built your entire lives by exploiting other people to serve your own vanity. You are absolutely perfect for Julian. At the mention of his name, the heavy attention in the room suddenly shifted. While I had been systematically dismantling my mother's remaining dignity, Julian Pierce had realized that his human shield was no longer useful. Chloe was still sobbing into her hands, completely oblivious to her surroundings. Julian had quietly detached himself from her side and was currently inching his way backward along the perimeter of the ballroom, attempting to use the chaotic screaming match as a distraction. He was practically tiptoeing along the flocked wallpaper, his eyes fixed intently on the heavy oak exit doors at the back of the venue. He was moving with the practiced stealth of a man who had fled from countless angry investors. He was only 5 feet away from freedom. He reached his hand out, wrapping his fingers around the brass door handle. Before he could push the heavy door open and disappear into the night, a large, muscular hand clamped down firmly onto his shoulder. The stern federal compliance officer stepped out from the shadows, physically blocking the exit with his massive frame. He looked down at the sweating, terrified con artist with a chilling professional smile. Leaving so soon, Mr. Pierce? The officer asked. The heavy oak main doors of the ballroom swung open with a resounding thud. 2 men wearing dark conservative suits and grim expressions marched into the venue. The gold shields clipped to their belts caught the harsh glare of the projector screen. The FBI had officially arrived. They bypassed the stunned wedding guests and walked with absolute terrifying purpose directly toward the man sweating profusely by the exit. Julian Pierce, you are under arrest for multiple counts of felony wire fraud, interstate embezzlement, and money laundering. The lead agent announced, his voice booming through the silent room. Turn around and place your hands behind your back. Julian puffed out his chest, attempting to summon the arrogant billionaire heir persona that had successfully duped my parents. He adjusted his silk tie and let out a scoff of manufactured outrage. There has clearly been a monumental misunderstanding here, gentlemen, Julian stated, flashing a strained version of his country club smile. Do you have any idea who I am? I am a Pierce. My family owns half the commercial real estate on the eastern seaboard. I suggest you lower your voices and call your superiors before my legal team completely destroys your careers. The second agent pulled a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his belt. He did not look intimidated. He looked entirely amused. "We know exactly who you are, Julian," the agent replied, stepping forward and grabbing Julian's shoulder. "Your financial crimes crossed 3 state lines and 2 international borders when you routed that $4 million through the Cayman Islands. And as for your powerful family coming to your rescue, you can forget about it. Your father told us exactly where to find you, Julian. He handed over your offshore account numbers this morning to avoid being indicted alongside you." The color instantly vanished from Julian's face. The realization that his own father had traded him to the federal government for a reduced sentence completely shattered his remaining bravado. He opened his mouth but produced only a pathetic, breathless squeak. Suddenly, a blur of white silk and hysterical screaming launched across the ballroom floor. Chloe, completely unhinged and entirely refusing to accept reality, threw herself bodily between Julian and the federal agents. She wildly slapped at the agent's arms, kicking her designer heels against their shins. "Get away from him!" Chloe shrieked, her voice tearing at the seams. "You are making a terrible mistake. He is a billionaire. He is my fiancé. You are ruining my wedding day. Serena paid you to do this because she is jealous. Leave him alone." The lead agent raised his hands, attempting to gently but firmly deflect the frantic woman attacking his partner. "Ma'am, step back immediately, or you will be charged with assaulting a federal officer." Chloe ignored the warning. She lunged forward again, grabbing the lapels of Julian's jacket, desperately trying to pull him away from the arresting officers. "Julian, fix this," she sobbed. "Call your lawyers. Tell them who you are." Julian looked down at the woman who had happily betrayed her own sister to secure his fake wealth. His eyes narrowed into slits of pure, venomous hatred. He did not see a fiancé. He saw an anchor dragging him down. With a vicious snarl, Julian raised his hands and shoved Chloe violently in the chest. "Get off me, you idiot!" Julian yelled, his voice echoing with ugly, brutal malice. "Do you honestly think I ever loved you? You were nothing but an easy mark, a pathetic, spoiled little girl desperate for a ring. You and your greedy parents were the easiest targets I have ever played." The force of his shove sent Chloe stumbling backward. Her high heels twisted beneath her, and she crashed hard onto the polished marble floor. She threw her hands out to break her fall. As her left hand hit the ground, the massive, flawless, custom-cut diamond she had been flaunting all evening struck the hard stone. A sharp, sickening crack rang out. The massive stone did not scratch the marble. Instead, the cheap cubic zirconia shattered into dozens of cloudy, dull fragments scattering across the floor like broken glass. The cheap metal band bent out of shape, confirming that the ultimate symbol of her superiority was nothing more than a worthless costume piece. Chloe sat on the floor, staring down at the broken glass surrounding her hand. The absolute finality of her humiliation washed over her. She let out a guttural, agonizing wail of pure despair, pulling her knees to her chest and rocking back and forth on the floor. The agent slammed Julian against the wall, securely fastening the handcuffs around his wrists and marching him roughly out of the ballroom. He did not look back at the woman weeping on the floor. I stood completely motionless, watching the predator exit the room. I felt David step up behind me, his hand resting warmly on the small of my back. The lead FBI agent did not follow his partner out the door immediately. Instead, he turned his sharp, assessing gaze away from the broken glass on the floor and locked eyes with my father. Winston was still kneeling by the sweetheart table, his breathing shallow and erratic. The agent slowly walked across the room, stopping directly in front of the ruined patriarch. He pulled a small notebook from his breast pocket. "Mr. Dubois," the agent said, his tone stripped of any professional courtesy, "we have a clear electronic trail showing $4 million moving directly from Dubois real estate accounts into Mr. Pierce's fraudulent shell company late Tuesday night. Given the massive scale of this international wire fraud, we are currently viewing this as a coordinated effort." Winston shook his head frantically, raising his trembling hands. "No," he gasped. "I was tricked. I am a victim. He promised me a seat on his board. I did not know he was a criminal." "That is an interesting defense, Mr. Dubois," the agent replied coolly. However, ignorance is rarely a successful legal strategy when moving millions across international borders without standard corporate approval. We need you to come with us downtown for immediate questioning regarding the wire transfer. Unless, of course, you can provide immediate documented proof that you are not a co-conspirator in this embezzlement scheme. Winston looked up at the federal agent, the crushing weight of a lengthy prison sentence bearing down on his chest. Then his desperate eyes slowly drifted to the right. He looked at the single piece of paper I had dropped onto the guest table. The Vanguard Acquisitions Contract. It was a legally binding document that would instantly transfer total ownership of his company to me. It would legally absorb his toxic debt, place the financial liability squarely onto my heavily fortified corporate shoulders, and officially declare the $4 million transfer as a hostile corporate takeover rather than a criminal conspiracy. It was his only lifeline. He could walk out of those doors in handcuffs and lose his freedom, or he could sign his entire legacy over to the daughter he had despised for exactly $1. Winston Dubois stared at the pen resting beside the contract, his hand trembling as he reached toward his ultimate surrender. Winston Dubois stared at the pen resting beside the contract, his hand trembling as he reached toward his ultimate surrender. His fingers hovered over the sleek metal cylinder, but his sheer panic paralyzed him. He let out a strangled gasp, and his hand dropped heavily back onto the polished wood of the table. He could not do it. He could not willingly sign away the empire he had spent a lifetime using as a weapon against his own blood. Instead, he did something that completely shattered the pristine, flawless image of the great Dubois patriarch. He slid off his knees and dragged himself across the cold marble floor. He crawled toward me. The man who had spent 30 years looking down his nose at me from his corner office was dragging his expensive tuxedo pants across the spilled champagne and shattered cubic zirconia. He lunged forward and grabbed the heavy white silk hem of my wedding dress, pulling the delicate fabric tight in his clammy fists. "Serena, please," he begged, his voice cracking into a pathetic, wet sob. "You cannot let them take me away. I am an old man. I will not survive in a federal prison. You have to buy the company right now. Give them the contract. Tell them you are assuming the debt. We are blood, Serena. You have to fix this." I looked down at his white knuckles clutching my dress. I felt absolutely nothing. No pity, no remorse, only the cold clinical satisfaction of a surgeon finally removing a malignant tumor. When I did not immediately respond, Winston frantically shifted his gaze. He looked up at David, who was standing firmly at my side, his broad shoulders tense and his expression completely unreadable. Winston desperately tried to appeal to the only other man in the room, hoping for some twisted sense of patriarchal solidarity. David, Winston pleaded, pulling roughly on my dress to get my husband's attention. "Talk some sense into her. You are her husband. You are the head of her household now. Tell your wife to stop this madness. Tell her to save her family. Tell her it is her duty to protect us." David stepped forward deliberately, placing his heavy leather shoes squarely onto the fabric of my dress right next to Winston's clutching hands. He pinned the silk firmly to the floor so Winston could not pull it any further or damage it. David looked down at the broken man with a gaze of absolute pure disgust. The muscles in David's jaw ticked as he stared at the pathetic creature cowering at his feet. "My family is my wife," David stated, his voice a low, lethal rumble that carried clearly across the silent ballroom. "And you skipped her wedding." Winston recoiled as if David had kicked him directly in the chest. He released my dress and slumped back onto his heels, his chest heaving as he frantically searched for another angle. He looked around the room at the federal agents waiting patiently by the door, at Vivian, who was still frozen in shock near the sweetheart table, and finally back at me. Finding no sympathy anywhere, he resorted to the oldest, most toxic manipulation tactic in his entire playbook, the classic narcissistic defense of the provider. "I did it all for you kids!" Winston cried out, slapping his hand dramatically against his chest. "Everything I built, every late night, every deal I made, every compromise I accepted was to secure a legacy for this family. I was trying to protect our status. I wanted to give you and Chloe the world. I was trying to build generational wealth. You are punishing me for trying to be a good provider. You are destroying the man who gave you everything. The sheer audacity of his lie ignited a fresh wave of cold fury in my chest. "You did absolutely nothing for us," I fired back, my voice slicing through the air like a whip. "Do not dare frame your pathetic greed as paternal sacrifice. You did not wire $4 million to an offshore account to secure our future. You did it purely for your own narcissistic vanity." I stepped closer, forcing him to crane his neck backward to look at me. "You wanted a seat on the board of the elite Belmont Country Club?" I continued, exposing the ugly truth to the entire room. "You wanted to sit in the VIP dining room and smoke cigars with the old money billionaires who have spent the last decade laughing behind your back. You drained your own corporate operating accounts because you were desperate to buy your way into a social circle that always viewed you as a desperate new money joke. You risked federal prison just so you could feel important at a golf course." Winston opened his mouth to deny it, but the words died in his throat. The wealthy guests standing around the perimeter of the room began to murmur among themselves, confirming my exact assessment of his social standing. The very people he had tried to impress were now looking at him with undisguised contempt. "You abandoned me at every single milestone of my life because I did not fit into your country club aesthetic," I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "You refused to pay my college tuition, but you happily dropped $50,000 on a country club initiation fee the very same week. You told me I was a bad investment while you poured millions into a fraudulent shell company run by a con artist who was sleeping with your favorite daughter." I reached into the small silk clutch I was holding and pulled out my cell phone. I unlocked the screen and tapped open my messages. "You claim you care about this family?" I said, holding the phone up so the glaring screen illuminated his pale, sweating face. "Let me read the exact text message you sent me at 8 o'clock this morning while I was putting on this dress, preparing to marry the man standing next to me." I cleared my throat and read his words aloud, ensuring every single syllable echoed through the massive ballroom. "I cannot make it today. Chloe is having a crisis with her venue and needs my credit card. Your little wedding will be fine. We will send a gift basket next week. Do not bother calling back, I am busy." I lowered the phone and stared directly into his terrified eyes. "My little wedding." I repeated the words, tasting like ash. "You could not even spare 2 hours to walk your own daughter down the aisle because you were too busy funding a fake wedding for a fake billionaire. You chose your own vanity over my basic existence. You chose a fraud over your own flesh and blood. And now your choices have finally caught up with you." I turned and walked back to the guest table. I picked up the Vanguard acquisitions contract and grabbed the sleek, heavy Mont Blanc pen resting beside it. The weight of the pen felt perfect in my hand. I walked back to Winston and held the expensive pen out to him. The federal compliance officer stepped forward, his handcuffs jingling against his belt, a stark reminder of the reality closing in around my father. "You have exactly 60 seconds," I stated, my voice completely devoid of any emotion. "You have 60 seconds to sign your empire over to the daughter you called a failure, or you leave this room in handcuffs." Winston stared at the contract. The reality of his impending doom finally crushed the last remaining fragments of his pride. He collapsed completely. The mighty patriarch, stripped of his arrogance, slid off his knees and crawled across the cold marble floor toward me. He reached out with trembling, sweating hands and grabbed the heavy white silk hem of my wedding dress. "Serena, please," he begged, his voice breaking into a pathetic, wet sob. "You cannot let them take me away." When I did not flinch, he frantically shifted his gaze, looking up at David. He pulled on the fabric of my gown, desperate to find an ally in the only other man in the room. David Winston pleaded, tears spilling down his wrinkled cheeks. "Talk some sense into her. You are her husband. Tell your wife to stop this. Tell her to save her family." David stepped forward deliberately, planting his leather shoe squarely on the hem of my dress to stop Winston from pulling it. He looked down at the cowering man with absolute pure disgust. "My family is my wife," David stated, his voice a low, lethal rumble. "And you skipped her wedding." Winston recoiled, releasing the silk fabric. He slumped back onto his heels, his chest heaving as he frantically searched for another angle. Finding no sympathy anywhere, he resorted to his classic narcissistic defense. "I did it all for you kids," Winston cried out, slapping his chest dramatically. Everything I built, every deal I made was to secure a legacy for this family. I was trying to protect our status. I wanted to give you and Chloe the world. You are destroying the man who gave you everything. You did absolutely nothing for us. I fired back, my voice slicing through the air like a whip. Do not dare frame your greed as paternal sacrifice. You did it purely for your own narcissistic vanity at the country club. You wanted a seat in the VIP dining room with billionaires who have spent the last decade laughing behind your back. You risked federal prison just so you could feel important on a golf course. I reached into my small silk clutch and pulled out my cell phone. I unlocked the screen and held it up so the glaring light illuminated his pale, sweating face. You claim you care about this family, I said. Let me read the exact text message you sent me this morning while I was preparing to marry the man standing next to me. I cleared my throat and read his words aloud, ensuring every syllable echoed through the silent ballroom. Chloe is having a crisis with her venue and needs my credit card. Your little wedding will be fine. Do not bother calling back. I lowered the phone and glared at him. My little wedding, I repeated. You could not even spare 2 hours to walk your daughter down the aisle because you were too busy funding a fraud. You chose your own vanity over my basic existence. I picked up the heavy Montblanc pen resting on the table and shoved it directly into his trembling hand. The clock is ticking, I commanded. You have exactly 60 seconds to sign your empire over to the daughter you called a failure, or you leave this room in handcuffs. With trembling hands and sobbing uncontrollably, Winston Dubois pressed the gold nib to the paper. He surrendered his legacy with jagged, uneven strokes, signing his name on the dotted line. The mighty patriarch was completely broken. The moment the ink dried, I stepped forward and pulled the document from beneath his hands. I did not offer him a comforting word. I simply turned and handed the executed contract directly to the Vanguard corporate attorneys waiting in the shadows. It was done. Dubois' real estate now belonged to me. The lead FBI agent nodded in satisfaction. He grabbed Julian by the bicep, hauling the disgraced con artist forward. Let us go, Mr. Pierce, the agent said, marching him roughly toward the exit. Julian did not fight back. Stripped of his fake billions, he simply slouched his shoulders and let the agents drag him away. The heavy metal exit doors swung open and the federal officers marched him out into the night. The grand ballroom was plunged into a heavy, ringing silence. Vivian broke it. Ever the dedicated social climber, my mother realized the audience was still watching. She desperately needed to sweep this catastrophic public humiliation under the rug. She smoothed her hands over her ruined gown and forced a painfully tight smile onto her face, trying to salvage the situation. Okay, Vivian announced, her voice shrill and overly bright. We signed. We gave you what you wanted, but we are still a family. We can move past this ugliness. Family is about forgiveness. I will host a dinner next week at the Buckhead House, just us. We can sit down and figure out how to handle the press. I stared at her, completely mesmerized by the sheer depth of her delusion. She actually believed she still possessed social leverage. I reached into David's jacket pocket and retrieved a crisp manila envelope. I stepped forward and held it out, interrupting her frantic planning. About the Buckhead House, I said, my tone flat and analytical. I own that too. When Vanguard acquired the corporate debts Winston defaulted on, we also acquired the collateral he used to secure them. Vivian's hand froze halfway to the envelope. The color drained from her face. I pushed the envelope directly against her chest. And this is your 30-day eviction notice. You have 1 month to pack your bags and vacate my property. Vivian ripped the envelope open, staring at the bold black letters as if they were written in a foreign language. The realization that she was losing her mansion, her staff, and her elite zip code finally broke through her impenetrable wall of denial. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. Suddenly, a bizarre sound erupted from the floor. Chloe, sitting amidst the shattered fragments of her cubic zirconia ring, suddenly burst into hysterical laughter. It started as a low, bubbling giggle and quickly escalated into a frantic, manic shriek. She threw her head back, laughing so hard she began to choke. Vivian and Winston stared at their golden child in absolute horror. The guests murmured, stepping further away from the unraveling family. Chloe abruptly stopped laughing. Her face contorted into a mask of pure, desperate agony, and she began to sob violently. She scrambled on the floor, dragging herself toward me, her ruined makeup leaving dark black streaks down her pale cheeks. "You cannot kick us out!" Chloe wailed, her voice echoing with raw panic. "You cannot take the house, Serena. You have to let us stay." I looked down at my sister, my expression completely blank. "I gave you 30 days, Chloe. Start packing." "No," Chloe screamed, using the ultimate manipulation tactic to force sympathy. "You do not understand. You have to save us. I am pregnant. I am carrying Julian's baby." The entire grand ballroom plunged into a suffocating dead silence. The sheer desperation of Chloe's announcement hung in the stale air like a toxic cloud. For a brief second, the remaining wealthy guests froze, their champagne glasses halted halfway to their mouths. Vivian reacted with the lightning speed of a seasoned predator sensing a sudden shift in the wind. The 30-day eviction notice slipping from her manicured fingers was instantly forgotten. She dropped to her knees on the cold marble floor, her ruined silk gown pooling around her as she fiercely wrapped her arms around Chloe's trembling shoulders. Vivian pulled her golden child against her chest, stroking her hair with exaggerated theatrical maternal devotion. Vivian snapped her head up and glared at me. Her eyes were wide with a triumphant manic gleam. She had found her ultimate weapon. "You hear that, Serena?" Vivian shrieked, her voice echoing off the crystal chandeliers. "Your sister is carrying the next generation of this family. She is bringing an innocent child into this world. You cannot put a pregnant woman on the street. It is completely inhumane. You have a moral obligation to provide for your niece or nephew. You need to tear up that eviction notice right now. You need to return the Buckhead house and restore our monthly allowance. Have you no soul, Serena? You are trying to leave a defenseless pregnant mother destitute." Vivian hugged Chloe tighter, rocking her back and forth. The country club elites watching from the shadows murmured among themselves. Vivian was banking on their inherent social conditioning, assuming the wealthy crowd would instantly side with a pregnant woman in distress. She was attempting to publicly shame me into a massive financial surrender, using an unborn child as a bulletproof human shield. I did not yield a single inch. I did not soften my posture, and I certainly did not feel an ounce of guilt. I looked down at the two women clinging to each other on the floor of the ballroom and felt a profound sense of absolute clinical detachment. I calmly reached into my evening bag and retrieved my cell phone. The bright glow of the screen illuminated the sharp angles of my face in the dim ballroom light. I slowly swiped past my wedding photos and opened my secure email application. "You have always possessed a truly breathtaking capacity for self-delusion, Chloe," I said, my voice slicing through Vivian's theatrical sobbing. "But this specific lie is mathematically and physically impossible." Chloe froze. Her sobbing hitched in her throat, and she slowly pulled her face away from Vivian's chest. She looked up at me, her mascara-stained eyes wide with a sudden frantic terror. I tapped the top email in my inbox and began to read. "When Julian first arrived at our family estate flaunting leased sports cars and cheap rented watches, I knew exactly what he was," I explained, pacing slowly in front of them. "I did not fall for the expensive suits or the heavily rehearsed old money charm. So I hired a private investigator to do a comprehensive background check. I received the final dossier this morning." Vivian's protective grip on Chloe loosened slightly. Winston, who had been completely silent since signing away his empire, slowly raised his head from his hands. "Julian Pierce did not just lie about his bank accounts." "Chloe," I said, reading directly from the meticulously documented federal report on my screen. "He lied about his basic biology. According to his verified medical records, Julian had a highly publicized, irreversible vasectomy exactly 6 years ago. He underwent the procedure during his first major fraud trial to avoid paying child support to his previous victims. It is physically completely impossible for you to be carrying his child." The air vanished from the room. Chloe let out a strangled, gasping sound, clutching her stomach as if I had physically struck her. But I was not finished. Furthermore, I continued, my voice rising to ensure every single person in the ballroom heard the final devastating truth. Julian Pierce is not a wealthy bachelor looking for a society bride. He has a legal wife named Brenda. They share a modest duplex in suburban Connecticut, along with their 3 teenage children. He has been married for 15 years, Chloe. He spends his holidays with them while he is out hunting for desperate, gullible women to fund his lifestyle. I lowered my phone and looked directly into my sister's horrified, hollow eyes. "You are not a fiancé, Chloe," I stated with brutal, surgical precision. "You were never going to be a billionaire wife. You were never going to rule high society. You were a mark. You were nothing but a convenient, highly gullible target. And you gladly destroyed your own sister just to wear a piece of shattered glass on your finger." The absolute finality of the truth crashed down onto Chloe with the force of a collapsing building. Her mind completely broke. The fragile delusional reality she had constructed over the past year shattered into a million irreparable pieces. A guttural, animalistic scream ripped out of Chloe's throat. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated madness. She violently shoved Vivian away, sending our mother sprawling onto her back across the marble floor. Chloe scrambled to her feet, her designer gown ripping at the seams as she lunged toward the nearest guest table. She grabbed a massive crystal vase overflowing with expensive white roses and hurled it across the room. The heavy crystal smashed against the wall, sending water and shattered glass exploding in every direction. She shrieked again, a mindless, deafening sound, as she flipped the entire table over, sending silverware and china crashing to the floor. Chloe tore through the reception hall like a rabid animal. She ripped down the expensive silk drapery framing the tall windows. She grabbed bottles of premium champagne and smashed them directly onto the polished dance floor. Her hands were bleeding, her hair was a tangled rat nest, and she continued to scream Julian's name mixed with incoherent strings of profanity. Winston remained frozen on the floor, too broken to even attempt to stop her. Vivian scrambled away from the flying glass, weeping hysterically, as she watched her prized corporate asset publicly self-destruct. The wealthy guests scrambled toward the exits, terrified of the screaming woman tearing the ballroom apart. I stood perfectly still beside David, entirely unaffected by the flying debris and the deafening chaos. I watched Chloe decimate the expensive wedding reception she had stolen from me. The visual metaphor was absolute perfection. I calmly turned my head and looked toward the team of broad-shouldered hotel security guards who had rushed into the ballroom upon hearing the smashing glass. They stood by the main doors waiting for an official directive. I caught the eye of the head of security and gave him a short, authoritative nod. "Please escort these uninvited guests off my property," I commanded, my voice cutting cleanly through Chloe's manic screaming. "They are trespassing." The hotel security team did not hesitate. 4 broad-shouldered men in dark tactical suits descended upon the wreckage of my former family. 2 guards immediately flanked Chloe. She was still thrashing on the floor, screaming Julian's name and demanding her billionaire lifestyle back with unhinged ferocity. They hauled her upward by her arms, her designer gown ripping further as she kicked her bare feet against their shins. She fought like a rabid animal, her mascara-stained face contorted into a mask of absolute pure madness. Vivian tried to brush the approaching guards away with a trembling hand, adjusting her ruined silk dress in a pathetic attempt to retain a shred of high society dignity. "Do not touch me," Vivian shrieked, her voice cracking into a shrill, hysterical register. "We are leaving. We do not need to be handled like common criminals." But the guards completely ignored her fabricated outrage, firmly gripping her elbows and marching her forcefully toward the exit. Winston did not require any physical force. The mighty patriarch of the Dubois Empire was entirely hollowed out. He shuffled forward, staring blankly at the marble floor, his shoulders slumped and his expensive tuxedo covered in sticky champagne and dust. He looked like an empty shell, stripped of the wealth, intimidation, and control that had defined his entire pathetic existence. He was a ruined man, walking toward a federal indictment, and he knew it. I watched them go without a single ounce of regret. Chloe continued to wail, her frantic, manic screams echoing down the corridor until the heavy wooden doors of the ballroom swung shut. The massive brass latches clicked into place with a resounding final thud. The room went completely dead silent. The silence that followed was not awkward or heavy. It was the breathtaking, beautiful silence of a sudden, massive release. I stood in the center of the wreckage. Smashed crystal vases littered the dance floor. Water pooled around the legs of overturned chairs. Crushed white roses and fragments of cheap cubic zirconia were scattered across the polished stone. Yet looking at the physical destruction my sister had caused, I felt incredibly light. The invisible, suffocating weight that had pressed down on my chest for my entire life had completely evaporated. The toxic infection of the Dubois family was finally permanently excised from my world. I let out a long, trembling exhale. My knees suddenly felt weak as the adrenaline began to drain from my bloodstream. Before I could even sway, David was there. He stepped intimately close and wrapped his strong arms tightly around my waist, anchoring me to the present. He did not ask if I was okay. He simply held me, his steady heartbeat thumping against my back radiating pure, absolute security. Then the crowd began to part. David's family, who had watched the entire explosive spectacle in stunned, respectful silence, stepped forward from the shadows of the room. I braced myself, expecting judgment or pity. I had just aired my family's ugliest, darkest secrets in the middle of my own wedding reception. I had ruthlessly dismantled my own blood relatives in front of his esteemed parents. But David's mother, Eleanor, did not look at me with pity. She walked directly across the glass-strewn floor, ignoring the mess completely. She stopped right in front of me, her eyes shining with fierce, unshed tears. She reached out and took my face in her soft, warm hands. "You are the strongest woman I have ever met," Eleanor said, her voice thick with genuine raw emotion. "You never have to fight them alone ever again, Serena. You belong to us now. We protect our own." She pulled me into a fierce, crushing hug. It was not the cold, stiff, obligatory embrace Vivian had perfected over the decades for country club photographs. It was a real, desperate maternal embrace. I felt a single hot tear slide down my cheek, a final physical release of the grief I had been holding on to for the little girl who was never loved. Eleanor gently pulled back and wiped the tear away with her thumb, offering me a bright, beautiful, affirming smile. David's father and brothers stepped up behind her, clapping David on the shoulder and offering me warm, welcoming nods. There was no judgment. There was only absolute validation and acceptance. I was not the Dubois family scapegoat anymore. I was Serena. I was exactly where I was meant to be. As if sensing the emotional shift in the room, the event staff sprang into coordinated action. The hotel manager snapped his fingers and a small army of waiters flooded the ballroom floor. They moved with quiet, ruthless efficiency. Brooms swept up the shattered crystal and the worthless fake diamonds. Towels soaked up the spilled premium champagne. They righted the overturned tables and replaced the ruined floral arrangements with fresh, pristine centerpieces from the backup reserves. Within 10 minutes, the physical evidence of Chloe's manic breakdown was completely erased. In the corner of the room, the DJ took his cue. He adjusted his mixer and slowly faded the music back in. He did not play the stiff classical music Winston had originally demanded to impress his country club friends. Instead, a warm, upbeat rhythm filled the vast space, carrying a vibrant, joyful energy that brought the room back to life. The remaining guests, David's extended family and our closest real friends, let out a collective breath. A cheer erupted from the back of the room, followed by a wave of genuine, enthusiastic applause. I turned to look up at David. His dark eyes were soft and filled with overwhelming, absolute love. He reached up and gently tucked a stray piece of hair behind my ear, tracing the line of my jaw with his thumb. "Are you ready to finally celebrate our wedding, Mrs. Hayes?" David asked, a slow, devastating smile spreading across his handsome face. I looked around the sparkling ballroom, surrounded by people who actually valued me for exactly who I was. I looked at the man who had stood faithfully by my side while I dismantled my abusers and reclaimed my future. "I have never been more ready in my entire life," I answered. David pulled me flush against his chest and dipped me low, pressing his lips to mine in a deep, passionate, consuming kiss. The crowd erupted into louder cheers and the joyful clinking of champagne glasses. There was no more anxiety. There was no more fear of judgment. The dark, looming shadow of the Dubois family had been entirely eradicated. The party resumed with untethered wild joy, a pure, unfiltered celebration of true family and genuine love. We danced and laughed until our feet ached, surrounded by the bright, unburdened promise of our new life together. 6 months later. 6 months later. The morning sun filtered through the floor-to-ceiling glass windows of my Atlanta penthouse, casting long golden shadows across the polished hardwood floors. I stood at the edge of the sprawling living room, holding a delicate porcelain cup of expensive loose-leaf white tea, watching the city wake up beneath me. The skyline was a breathtaking tapestry of steel and glass, and for the first time in my entire life, I felt like I truly owned my place within it. I turned away from this panoramic view and walked back to my massive oak desk. A thick, glossy folder sat squarely in the center of the dark wood, catching the morning light. It was the final quarterly report for Vanguard Acquisition's newly integrated division. The bold, crisp logo on the cover read Vanguard Urban Development. Beneath it, in small, unobtrusive print, lay the words, formerly Dubois Real Estate. The rebranding was a complete and total success. I had spent the last half-year systematically purging the corporate rot my father had allowed to fester for decades. I fired his incompetent country club cronies, liquidated the toxic, underperforming strip malls he had hoarded, and restructured the entire management hierarchy. The company that had once been a bloated monument to Winston Dubois and his fragile ego was now a sleek, highly profitable machine, operating entirely under my absolute control. The Dubois name was effectively erased from the commercial real estate map, replaced by a brand that represented actual value integrity and flawless execution. Taking a slow sip of my tea, I tapped the trackpad on my laptop. The screen woke up immediately, displaying my private email inbox. There was a new message from my lead attorney, Marcus, containing his routine monthly update on the outstanding liabilities. I clicked the subject line and read the crisp bullet points detailing the current status of my former family. Julian Pierce was exactly where he belonged. A federal judge had shown zero leniency during sentencing, slapping the fake billionaire with a solid 15 years in a high-security federal penitentiary for interstate wire fraud, embezzlement, and tax evasion. There would be no early parole. His legal wife in Connecticut had immediately filed for divorce, securing full custody of their 3 children and seizing whatever legitimate assets he had left. He was penniless, locked in a concrete cell, stripped of his silk suits and his manufactured charm. Winston Dubois had suffered a fate arguably worse than prison for a man of his profound arrogance. Stripped of his company, his luxury vehicles, and his hidden offshore accounts, he was left completely exposed to the crushing weight of federal tax liens. The report confirmed my former patriarch was currently employed as a shift manager at a big-box hardware store in the deep suburbs. The man who used to scream at elite executives for wearing the wrong shade of gray was now wearing a bright orange polyester vest. He spent his days directing teenagers to the plumbing aisle, organizing displays of power tools, and apologizing to irate customers over expired coupons just to keep his minimum wage salary from being entirely garnished by the IRS. His feet ached on the concrete floors, and he answered to a regional manager half his age. Vivian had experienced a spectacular social execution. The news of the FBI raid and Winston's subsequent financial ruin had spread through high society faster than a wildfire. She was swiftly and mercilessly exiled from the prestigious Jack and Jill Society. Her membership at the Belmont Country Club was permanently revoked under a strict morality clause. The wealthy women who used to drink her premium champagne and compliment her designer gowns now actively crossed the street to avoid being seen with her. She was a total social pariah, unable to show her face at the club, trapped in a cheap, rented 2-bedroom apartment. For the first time in 40 years, she had to scrub her own floors and cook her own meals, entirely invisible to the elite world she had worshipped. And then there was Chloe, the ultimate golden child, the supposed heir to a billionaire dynasty, was currently working at a mid-tier retail clothing store in a dying suburban shopping mall. Her delusions of grandeur had been completely shattered that night in the ballroom. The pregnancy lie had unraveled instantly when she was forced to submit to a medical evaluation following her violent psychotic break. The court had ordered her into mandatory intensive therapy as part of her plea deal for destroying hotel property and assaulting federal officers. She spent her days wearing a scratchy uniform, folding cheap sweaters on clearance tables, and dealing with rude shoppers. Her evenings were spent sitting in a folding chair talking to a state-mandated counselor about her shattered reality. I finished reading the email and calmly closed the laptop. There was no surge of vindictive joy. There was no lingering bitterness. There was simply the quiet, clean satisfaction of a ledger finally being balanced. They had made their choices, and the universe had simply handed them the bill. A soft buzz vibrated against the polished wood of my desk. I glanced down at my cell phone. A text message had just arrived from an unsaved number. I picked up the device and read the short, desperate message flashing on the bright screen. It was from Vivian. "It is Thanksgiving next week. We bought a turkey. Please, Serena, we miss you." I stared at the glowing letters, studying the pathetic attempt at emotional manipulation. 6 months of absolute silence, and she actually believed a cheap grocery store turkey and a holiday calendar date could erase a lifetime of psychological abuse and financial betrayal. She believed she could summon the scapegoat back to the slaughterhouse simply by asking nicely. I searched my heart for a spark of anger. I searched for sadness, for grief, for the mother I never truly had. I found nothing. I felt absolutely nothing but a vast, impenetrable, absolute indifference. They were strangers to me now, ghosts from a past life that no longer held any power over my present reality. Without a single ounce of hesitation, I swiped left on the message. I tapped the delete icon, erasing the text permanently. Then I opened the contact settings and blocked the number, ensuring the silence between us would remain absolute and eternal. The heavy oak doors of the penthouse office swung open. I looked up and felt an instant, overwhelming rush of genuine warmth flood my chest. David walked into the room, wearing soft gray sweatpants and a fitted white t-shirt, looking incredibly handsome and entirely at ease. Trailing happily at his heels were our two newly adopted rescue dogs, a pair of scruffy golden retrievers who immediately trotted over to sniff my shoes and nudged their wet noses against my hands. David smiled, his dark eyes crinkling at the corners as he walked around the desk and wrapped his strong arms around my waist. He kissed my forehead, pulling me close against his chest. "Are you ready for breakfast, Mrs. Hayes?" he asked, his voice a low, comforting rumble. "I just put the coffee on." I looked at my husband, my actual family, and leaned my head against his strong shoulder. The penthouse was filled with bright morning light. The dogs were happily playing with a rope toy near the window, and my future was completely wide open. "I am perfectly ready," I replied, leaning up to capture his lips in a soft, sweet kiss. Sometimes the sweetest revenge isn't destroying the people who hurt you. It's letting them destroy themselves while you simply refuse to save them. The most profound lesson from Serena's journey is that true empowerment comes from refusing to participate in the toxic cycles established by those who seek to diminish us. For years, she allowed her family's cruelty to define her worth, only finding peace when she stopped fighting for their approval and started investing in her own autonomy. By choosing to step away and thrive on her own terms, she demonstrated that emotional independence is the ultimate victory. We cannot control the behavior of others, but we can always control our own reaction to it. Choose your own path and thrive regardless of their judgment.